So today we're going to dig into a really pivotal moment in the Cold War, an operation in Guatemala called PBSuccess. We're going to explore how this single covert action, which was celebrated as a huge win at the time, ended up casting this incredibly long and devastating shadow for decades to come. And to really wrap our heads around this story, we have to start with this deeply uncomfortable question. How can an operation that was officially stamped as a success by its creators, how can that success lead directly to this, a brutal 36-year civil war? It's this short-term win that kicks off a domino effect, one that would eventually cost more than 200,000 lives. To see how that happened, we've got to rewind the clock to before the coup. So before the coup, you have to picture this. Guatemala was in the middle of this incredible democratic experiment. It was known as the 10 Years of Spring, and it all started back in 1944 when a popular uprising kicked out a dictator. And right at the heart of this new democratic era was President Jacobo Arbenz's big idea, an agrarian reform law called Decree 900. The goal was, both simple and totally revolutionary: give land to the people who had none. And you can see right here why that reform was so desperately needed. The inequality was just staggering. A tiny elite, just 2% of the population, controlled almost all of the good farmland. This left the vast majority of rural Guatemalans, many of them indigenous Maya, completely trapped in poverty. But a domestic reform this big doesn't stay local for long. It very quickly got the attention of a massive American company, and by extension, a U.S. government completely obsessed with the Cold War. Okay, so this is where it all collides, right? You've got corporate interests and Cold War politics. The United Fruit Company was the biggest landowner in Guatemala, and it saw its huge, unused tracts of land being targeted. So it launched this massive PR and lobbying campaign in Washington. And their genius move? They painted Arbenz's democratic reforms as a secret Soviet-backed communist takeover. In the super paranoid climate of the 1950s, that was all President Eisenhower and his administration needed to hear. He gave the CIA the green light to take Arbenz out. Now, here's the thing. The CIA's plan wasn't about sending in the Marines. No, it was way more subtle than that. In a way, much more clever. This was going to be a war fought with psychology and propaganda. So check this out. The actual military force they put together, it was tiny, almost a joke. Their real weapons were things like a secret radio station broadcasting completely fake news and battle reports. They had planes dropping propaganda leaflets to create panic. They planted a constant stream of rumors. The entire point was to convince Guatemala's own army that a massive invasion was happening and that fighting back was completely hopeless. And this slide, this is the whole magic trick right here. The reality was a small, weak little force that crossed the border and a couple of bombing raids. But the perception, which the CIA carefully manufactured, was of this giant, unstoppable rebel army backed by the full power of the United States. It was that gap between what was real and what people believed was real that completely shattered the will of the Guatemalan military. So what happens when your own army won't fight for you? Well, President Arbenz was forced to resign in June of 1954. And just like that, the 10 years of spring were over. The takedown of Guatemala's democratic project was incredibly fast and unbelievably brutal. The new U.S.-backed leader, a guy named Carlos Castillo Armas, didn't waste a single second. Decree 900 was immediately scrapped, and all that land went right back to the United Fruit Company. Political parties were banned, unions were crushed, and any kind of dissent was met with arrests or exile. The whole democratic experiment was just erased. So you've got this scene, right? In Guatemala City, democracy is literally being torn down. But back in Washington, they're popping champagne corks, hailing it as a clean, cheap victory against communism. But they were celebrating way, way too soon. For the people of Guatemala, the real price of this success was only just beginning. Because the long-term fallout, well, it's just horrific. By crushing this peaceful democratic movement, the coup basically slammed the door on any hope for political change through normal means. And that created a power vacuum that was pretty much guaranteed to be filled by violence. And it was. In just 6 years, the country spiraled into a civil war that would last almost 4 decades. It would even include a state-led genocide against the indigenous Maya. And the human cost, it's just a number on a slide. But try to imagine it. 200,000 people, killed or just disappeared. A UN-backed Truth Commission later found that the state military and its allies were responsible for the overwhelming majority of those atrocities. Okay, so Why does a story from the 1950s still matter so much today? Well, because Operation PBSuccess is like the perfect tragic case study in the unintended and devastating consequences of this kind of foreign intervention. You can kind of see the playbook laid out, right? You take a local democratic movement that's all about land reform, and you look at it through this crazy, distorted Cold War lens. A fight over a company's bottom line gets spun into an existential threat to national security. And a short-term, tactical win, getting rid of one guy, ends up unleashing decades of instability that the people who planned it never have to deal with. And that right there, that's the real tragedy. This coup didn't just change the government. It fundamentally poisoned the country's entire political culture. It sent a loud and clear message to a whole generation of Guatemalans. Trying to create change through democracy is a waste of time. And that belief is what fueled the armed conflicts for the next 30-plus years. So all of this leaves us with one last really important question to think about. From the narrow viewpoint of Washington in 1954, Operation PBSuccess was a mission accomplished. But if you look at it from the perspective of the next 36 years of Guatemalan history, it was an absolute catastrophe. It really makes you ask, when we call an operation a success, whose clock are we using?